Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of CDBG Environmental Review Training 2021. I'm Ed Bosch, Acting Environmental Officer and Project Manager with Iowa Economic Development Authority. All right, so the first topic to cover is flooding. As you can see, many of us remember this, Cedar Rapids in 2008. Quite astounding when you think about what the Cedar River normally looks like and how far out of its banks it got in this particular case. Believe, if I remember right, that was a 500-year flood. So very extreme. National news, all that. So regulations on floodplain activity sprung out of the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, which is then followed by an executive order for floodplain management in 1977 and the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973. And that is referenced at CFR 58.6. If you have a project that is in a floodplain and does not meet one of the exceptions that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, you have to go through what's called the 8-step process. Step 1, determine whether you're in a 100-year floodplain or a 500-year floodplain, which are applicable to what are called critical actions. And we'll go over those later as well. You need to publish an early notice of the proposal to consider an action in the floodplain, and that is a 15-day comment period. They need to evaluate all practical alternatives to locating the proposed action in the floodplain, identify potential impacts associated with being in the floodplain, design or modify action to minimize adverse impacts and preserve the beneficial values of the floodplain area. Then reevaluate whether the proposed action is even practicable. Then publish a final public notice of what your decision is and to identify why there is no practical alternative, as well as the alternatives and mitigation measures that were considered. There is a 7-day minimum comment period on this final public notice. After those 7 steps, step 8 would be to implement proposed action with any mitigation measures. The 8-step process has to be concluded before you complete your review and publish your finding of no significant impact and request for release of funds. However, as just about everybody does, you can publish the notice required in step 7 above in the 8-step process, as well as the finding of no significant impact and request simultaneously. Of course, then that becomes a 15-day notice, but the 7 days are included within the 15-day notice for the funds and request for release of funds. So you cover them both in that same period. So speaking in more detail about the 8 steps, identify your flood hazard. How do you do that? Well, you use FEMA maps to determine where the flood hazard area, both 100 and 500-year floodplains, are. And check for these maps, flood insurance rate maps or flood hazard boundary maps, which is a less detailed version, at the website here that is listed. When you get to that website, you create a fermet, which just is a nice word for a snippet of the entire map, but make sure you show the FEMA map number and panel. Mark the project's boundary on the map, and then use that document in your environmental review record. If you have unmapped flood hazard areas, contact Bill Capuccio at DNR, show him where the project is, and ask if he knows of any special flood hazard areas that would affect your project. All right, so on the map again, creating your fermet, type in your address, click View Map, zoom into the project site, click to make your fermet, move the pink box to the project area on your map, and then save that image as a PDF. And again, you will include that in your documentation in your ERR. Determine if the project is in a special flood hazard area, or again, if it's a critical action in a 500-year floodplain. Special flood hazard areas are shown as Zone A, and they are the 100-year floodplain, and they are drawn based on a flood elevation. Critical actions, which are the reason you would look at a 500-year floodplain, are shown as a Zone B or a shaded X on the map. Flood zone terms. Well, the most critical area is known as the floodway. That's basically the channel of the body of water plus the area surrounding it that tends to flood, but flood in a way that is the moving water of the flood. So obstructing that obviously has a lot of consequences. So that would be number one concern. And we do not allow, well, we'll have a slide a little bit later about that on the floodways. Then you go to Zone A, the 100-year floodplain. And then beyond that is Zone B, the 500-year floodplain. Again, spelled out a little bit in terms of the risk, 1% per year, 0.2% per year, and outside of any of these is considered minimal flood risk, less than 0.2% per year. Doesn't mean it can't ever happen, and I think it may have here in recent years where it actually was beyond the 500-year floodplain a little bit in some instances, but should be a very rare occurrence. Okay, back to the floodway. It is, as I said, the portion carrying the water flow, the actual flow of the floodwater, and where the flood hazard is the greatest, obviously. It's designated as Zone AE on a firm. CDBG assistance is prohibited in a floodway, except for functional dependent uses such as a dam or a bridge, or actual floodplain restoration activity. And those kind of activities, dams, bridge, or restoration, are rare under the CDBG regular program component. I suppose not impossible, but you very rarely, well, I have not seen any in my time with IEDA, but like I said, it is possible. Critical actions. What are critical actions? Well, it's something where even a slight chance of flooding would be of great impact and might result in loss of life, injury, or property damage. So one example would be flooding an essential or irreplaceable record storage or emergency services. Obviously, if you're having a major flood event, you don't want your emergency services to be within the flood. Or sanitary sewer plant. You don't want that shutting down or backing up into a nearby waterway. Can also be critical in terms of individuals. If you have hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living, where the mobility of the residence is severely restricted. It'd be tough to get them out in the case of a flood. That's considered critical action. Also, prisons are mobility restricted, and you wouldn't want to be necessarily having to evacuate those either. If your project is in a 100-year floodplain, or it's a critical action in a 500-year floodplain, you've got three choices basically. You can reject the project site, avoid the flood hazard completely, look for a different location. You can determine if your floodplain management might be inapplicable and meet an exception. We will go over those, and they are very few. Or go through the 8-step process and take a look at alternatives and how to minimize flood hazards and restore the floodplain if there should be any change made to it. So exceptions. Well, you could have what they call a LOMA, a letter of map amendment, which is a correction to the map based on some sort of better physical data, engineering type data, hydrological data. A letter of map amendment, a LOMAR as it's called, is a letter of map revision when the particular site has been proven to be elevated above the special hazard flood area. Now, that takes a certified elevation survey to prove that you are above the base flood elevation. So it's not just a simple request and say that, yes, I'm higher than that. You have to prove it. Or finally, a CLOMAR, a conditional letter of map revision, used if the proposed changes are made to a project that would get it out of the floodplain area. Then a LOMAR, then the LOMAR could be granted upon those conditions being met. All right. Other exceptions: restoration, preservation of natural and beneficial values of a floodplain or wetland, including land acquisition, provided property is cleared of all structures, the property is dedicated to flood control, wetlands, park, or open space, permanent covenant to preserve floodplain or wetland from future development is in place. So you can, for instance, I was involved back in my city days with a project where there was a trailer park that had been heavily damaged in a flood. The trailer park was subsequently sold. All of the trailers were cleared from the property. The city converted that whole area to soccer and softball fields. Now that is something that actually is to the benefit of a floodplain, and so it is allowed. And there is a covenant with the land that says it has to be kept in open space recreational purpose in perpetuity. You may also have a project site with an incidental portion only an incidental portion in a floodplain. If there's no construction or modification of the floodplain or wetland, if there is site drainage that's adequate and without adverse effect on a wetland, and again, a permanent covenant to preserve a floodplain or wetland use, that's also acceptable, but has to be an incidental portion and it cannot have anything on it. So maybe the edge of a property, for instance, where there's no development, maybe it's just a landscaped area, that could be an exemption. All right, so back to the early public review, 15-day comment period. You need to include the required elements in the notice. There's the citation reference for you. And we also have a sample notice on our website. And remember, that is before you do any of the rest of your normal ERR publications or activities. Has to come first. Going back to the steps, the 8 steps, identify and evaluate practical alternatives. You need to consider factors, natural, social, economic, legal factors. And the sites that you consider should be, alternate sites should be outside of the floodplain, because otherwise you're gaining nothing. You're just going from one part of the floodplain to another. So that doesn't do you any good in terms of meeting floodplain requirements. So it has to be out of the floodplain if it's an alternative site. Or there could be other methods that achieve the project objective or purposes that don't affect the floodplain. And of course, there's always the alternative of no action, although, as I say, in the real world, that's often not truly a practical alternative, but always should be considered. And the burden on doing these alternative evaluations is on the RE. Identifying impacts to life and property, obviously, impacts to the floodplain itself, and there can be positive and negative. Positive, again, would be creating an open space. Concentrated and dispersed effects, and short and long term. An example of long term would be, as the caption there indicates, would project encourage future floodplain development? I think a clear example of that would be if you were running sewer and water lines through a floodplain that would lead to development of that floodplain further down the road. That would be considered a negative impact. All right. Within the floodplain itself, you need to look at minimizing the change to the floodplain. And this is a pretty rigorous, strict standard, reducing harm to the smallest possible degree beyond mitigation or alleviation. Reestablish the environment in which the natural and beneficial floodplain values can operate. If your project affects the floodplain at all. And prevent modification to the natural floodplain or maintain as closely as possible to its natural state throughout the project and after the project is complete. So if the project is still feasible, considering the steps that you've already gone through, you need to minimize the actions and opportunities to restore and preserve floodplain values. Look at that. Impacts to the floodplain, of course, with step 4. So after considering that, do alternatives rejected in step 3 appear feasible now? You may want to prepare a table to compare the adverse impacts of your different alternatives to help you see that. If neither proposed project nor alternatives are acceptable, then in that case, the alternative is no action at all. If no practical alternative exists, inform the public of that. Again, you have a 7-day minimum comment period. Your notice at the end of the steps, reason why the project must be located in the floodplain if you go forward, the list of alternatives considered, and addresses of those alternatives or area locations if there is no true address. All mitigation measures to be taken and actions to restore and preserve the natural and beneficial values of the floodplain should also be part of that notice. And again, that can be combined with your notice of intent to request release of funds and your FONSI. Sample file notice again on the HUD Exchange website, and I believe it's also on our website. The RE has a continuing responsibility to ensure that measures in step 7 are implemented. So it's not just that you say these things and walk away from it. Someone has to be responsible to make sure that any kind of mitigation or restoration activities are followed through on. And finally, the actual sites that were identified and considered as practical alternatives should be identified, and mitigation measures that have been applied to the proposed project design and incorporated into any agreements are part of the RE's continuing responsibility. Going to the checklist, how do you document this? Make a statement that the project is or is not in a floodplain. Show us the map that you used to give us the map panel number, and then show us by uploading the image, and document the 8-step decision-making process and the required publications. Okay, so this is the flood insurance requirements form from 58.6. And most HUD programs require applicants to carry flood insurance if in a 100-year floodplain. However, CDBG state grant recipients are exempt from this requirement. And a community and its citizens are eligible to obtain floodplain insurance only if they do participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Okay, and there are some additional sources if you want further information. Noise control. Okay, Congress passed the Noise Control Act of 1972, amended by Quiet Communities Act of 78. And what we're looking at here is obviously decibels, normal acceptable range equal to or less than 65 decibels, unacceptable 65 to 75, or normally unacceptable, and unacceptable under basically any circumstances is greater than 75 decibels. Some projects are noise sensitive, some are not. Kind of things that we typically fund that are noise sensitive are owner-occupied housing and community facilities. But downtown revitalization, water and sewer, stormwater projects, economic development are not noise sensitive. So if you have one of those, you don't really need to be concerned about noise analysis. But if you don't, if you have an applicable project, determine if the project is located within threshold distance and calculate that distance from the noise assessment location. Within 1,000 feet of a major or busy road, 3,000 feet of a railway, 15 miles of an airport. Now, the noise assessment location is, I suppose because they had to pick a spot, it's located 6.5 feet in front of the facade of the proposed building at the point that is closest to the noise source. If there's more than one building, use the building nearest to the noise source. And of course, that isn't so you know where to measure from. Use Google Maps, find the location, right-click, click on the first point, then drag to the second location, and it will give you the distance. If within 15 miles of an airport, okay, so civil airports are those designated in the FAA's National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. And in this case, however, only certain airports are subject to noise assessment, and that is based on emplanements. And you can find what those are by going to the link shown there and filtering for Iowa. And if there are less than 9,000 emplanements a day, I'm sorry, in a year, then you can assume that a community noise concern is not present. And within the state of Iowa, there are only 5 airports that exceed that 9,000 enplanement figure. And those are Des Moines, Sioux City, Waterloo, Dubuque, and Cedar Rapids airports. If you're not within 15 miles of any of those, then you do not have to worry about a noise analysis in terms of airports. If you are within 1,000 feet of a roadway, we'll define what the threshold is for that here in a few slides, but look for the average daily traffic count at the DOT website. And then from your location, can only be done probably through a site visit, all of these things. The effective distance, the distance to the nearest stoplight, stop sign, the average speed of the vehicles there, average daily trips, that's from the website, and then night fraction and road gradient if you can find it. If not, you can use the defaults that are shown there. 15% and then the traffic at night and 2% for gradient, average gradient. So at the DOT website, you can find average daily traffic counts by searching for your location and by the year. And then you'll get something that looks like this. That's what happens to be in Des Moines, so it does have medium truck, heavy truck, auto, all broken out. Some other lesser roads may not, but you will find data to help you on this website. County roads, they are considered a major road according to the legislation. They don't break down types of vehicles like the previous slide from Des Moines area showed, but then you use defaults. And you use the average daily traffic counts to determine the type of road it is. Most county roads are major or minor collectors. Now, in terms of this chart, unless it's a county road, I would say that the bottom two, minor collectors and local, I would not particularly be concerned about, because the noise that would be generated from many of those, unless it's extremely unusual, is not going to be a factor in your environmental review. But again, if you have even if it's a minor collector, if it is a county road, then you still have to consider it. So here's an example of county road. In this case, it's in the major collector classification, and does break down automobiles, medium truck, heavy truck, and all of that is plugged into your noise calculator. Turning to railroads, if within 3,000 feet of a railroad, which many places in Iowa obviously are. So you need the crossing number to plug into the website link shown there. Find out how many trains per day, number of cars per train. On average, if you can't find it, use 50. Number of engines, again, there's a default of 2, diesel or electric, rails welded or bolted, speed of train, and percent of night operations. And if it happens to be in a quiet zone, you get a break if you're near a crossing. I don't know that there are very many quiet zones in rural Iowa, but it's worth checking. There aren't very many in urban Iowa either. I'm sure there are those are difficult to achieve. So here's an example of the noise calculator for rail, but there's also a calculator for roadways. So HUD's policy when it comes to noise, they don't like any kind of new construction. And it's prohibited if you've got an unacceptable noise exposure level. Even in the case of housing rehabilitation, you are to encourage or strongly encourage noise attenuation features or convert to a land use compatible with high noise levels. Well, if the housing rehab is in an unacceptable noise zone above 75 decibels, the RE is supposed to strongly encourage conversion to another land use. Now, that's very difficult to do in the real world when someone has been living in the house for 50 years and really isn't bothered by the train that is going through their backyard, basically. So in that case, and I had faced that at the city level, we did noise attenuation as best we could through landscaping and through insulation and noise barriers, probably not the right construction term for it, but there were noise attenuation features in windows and doors that were replaced to reduce the level. And make sure if it's a rehab project that the individuals living there are made aware of what the noise level is, whether they care or not. It covers you to let them know. All right, back to the checklist. Make a statement. It is or is not a noise sensitive use. And the project is or is not within the decibel threshold criteria. Map showing distances to the noise generator, from the project to the noise generator. Noise calculation spreadsheet, and a listing of any attenuation features that you made part of the project. Okay, water quality protection, soil source aquifers. This is very easy. One very easy element to consider in the state of Iowa. Why? Because there aren't any. In fact, there aren't any in the region of HUD that we're in, Region 7, in these 4 states. So they do require that this map is put into the ERR just to prove it. So, and you can find it at this link shown on the slide. Okay, again, make the statement, project's not located within the area of an EPA designated soil source aquifer, and then just copy that map. All right, wetlands. Similar to floodplains, not quite the same animal though. Wetlands are areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, under normal circumstances, support vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So every little pond you see or every little low spot is not necessarily wetland. There are criteria that have to be met. Wetlands generally require presence of 3 conditions: hydric soils, hydrophilic vegetation, and year-round and seasonal water. Federal authorities protecting wetlands through Executive Order 11990 avoid to the extent possible long and short-term adverse effects. associated with modification or destruction of wetlands, and avoid direct or indirect support of new construction in wetlands whenever there is an alternative. Then you also have the authority granted through Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and 24 CFR Part 55. That takes you back to the 8-step decision-making process. So use the Wetlands National Inventory Mapper. There's the link. And find your location. Unclick all the boxes except wetlands, so you get rid of the other overlays. Click on the legend, click on print, and then enter a title. And put that resulting map into the ERR, and it'll clearly show you where the wetlands are. And again, please mark your project location on that map so we can easily see that it's is or is not in the wetland. 8-step process, it is the same as you go through for a floodplain. So I don't think we need to go through all those again. As with floodplain evaluation, it has to be concluded prior to you saying that your environmental review is complete and prior to you publishing your finding of no significant impact and intent to request release of funds. On the checklist, make a statement. Project is or is not in the wetland. Give the web address of the wetland mapper that you used. Then show us the map that you accessed from the website. And if you had to go through the 8-step process, document that and document the 8-step process required publications. I'm having trouble here with the slides for some odd reason. Not able to go forward. I'm going to stop recording and see if I can fix this glitch.